The silence was the first casualty. It did not die with a bang, but with a splintering crack, like ice under impossible weight. For Elian, the silence had been a thin, precious membrane stretched over the roaring chaos of 100 minds in a single, crowded market square. He was the consortium's finest reader, a scalpel designed to excise a single thought from a symphony of psychic noise. But the target had been shielded not by technology but by a void, a pocket of absolute nothingness that, when breached, created a vacuum. Nature and the minds of men abhorred it. Everything rushed in. The market square, the distant sector guards, the frightened child clutching a synth sugar candy, the merchant calculating his losses, the assassin waiting in the wings, all of it. Every thought, every fear, every fleeting daydream collapsed into the space Elian had carved open. It was a psychic implosion. The shrapnel was made of soul stuff, jagged edges of panic, molten cores of rage, needle points of terror. They tore through him, shredding the delicate architecture of his consciousness. His body, a forgotten anchor, hit the grimy cobblestones. The world dissolved into a smear of screaming light and sound, a cacophony that had no physical source but was deafening all the same. He was not a man. He was a resonance chamber, shattered and ringing with the agony of 1,000 discordant notes. Through the storm, one presence remained constant, a monolith of quiet. Executor 7, designation Kale. Kale moved through the psychic maelstrom as a ship moves through water, displacing it, unaffected by its temperature or tide. His conditioning was a fortress, his mind a disciplined, silent space. He registered the mission's failure with the cold, detached clarity of a diagnostic report. Objective, compromised. Asset, incapacitated. Protocol dictated a clean retrieval, or if retrieval was unfeasible, termination. The asset was a repository of sensitive data. Its capture by opposing forces was an unacceptable outcome. He saw Elian's form, a pale comma on the ground, twitching as phantom pains racked his limbs. The air around him shimmered with the psychic residue, a visible distortion like heat haze. Kale's optical sensors filtered it out, categorizing it as non-threatening environmental interference. But he could feel it another way, a low hum against his skin, a pressure behind his eyes, a faint echo of the pain that was tearing Elian apart. This was not in his programming. Sensation without data was a malfunction. He knelt, his armored knee sinking slightly into the mud-caked stone. Elian's eyes were open but saw nothing, the irises a turbulent gray like a storm-tossed sea. A thin line of blood trickled from his nostril, stark crimson against the alabaster of his skin. He was beautiful, in the way a broken porcelain doll is beautiful, a testament to a fragile, intricate perfection that no longer existed. Kyle's orders were clear. He could terminate the asset with a single precise neurodisruptor pulse. Efficient, clean. It would end the psychic noise. It would end the asset's suffering. It would fulfill the mission parameters. His hand went to the weapon holstered at his hip. His fingers, clad in matte black tactical gloves, curled around the grip. The haptic feedback was familiar, a cool reassurance of function and purpose, but his hand did not draw the weapon. He watched as another tremor seized Elian's body, a whimper escaping his lips that was lost in the din of the panicked crowd. The sound did not reach Kale's audio receptors, but he heard it anyway, a vibration deep in the cavity of his chest. He was not an asset. The thought was an anomaly, a rogue line of code in a flawless system. It was not his own. It was an echo, a desperate plea broadcast from the wreckage of Elian's mind, a single coherent thought in the overwhelming static. Please, the quiet. Kale's mission parameters flickered across his internal display, a waterfall of sterile green text. Priority 1, secure the objective. Priority 2, preserve the asset. Priority 3, sanitize the area of engagement. Elian was both asset and objective. Preserving him was the higher priority, but his current state made him a liability. The logic was inescapable. And yet... Cale's gaze traced the line of Elian's jaw, the frantic pulse beating at the base of his throat. He saw the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of his nose, a detail his sensors had cataloged but never assigned meaning. They were like constellations on pale skin, meaningless data points that suddenly felt significant. He made a decision. It was not based on logic. It was not derived from protocol. It was an instinct, primal and absolute, rising from the core of his being that the consortium had tried so hard to excise. He holstered his weapon. With a movement as fluid and silent as the fall of night, he slid one arm beneath Elian's shoulders and the other under his knees. The body he lifted was shockingly light, all sharp angles and trembling limbs. Elian's head lolled back, resting in the crook of Cale's arm. The psychic screaming intensified for a moment, a direct, terrified response to the physical contact, then it softened. It did not disappear, but the razor edges seemed to dull against the unyielding quiet of Cale's mind. He held the broken reader against the solid black of his combat armor, a shield of plasteel and programming. But the shield was facing the wrong way. It was not protecting Cale from the world. It was protecting the world within his arms. The noise began to recede, coalescing around them, held at bay by the sheer, silent gravity of the executor. Cale stood, his movements economical and certain. He held his cargo as if it were infinitely precious, a thing of impossible fragility. He began the long walk back through the chaos, a black-clad monolith carving a path of silence. The journey back was a fugue state, a blur of fractured sensations stitched together by the rhythmic, percussive beat of Kyle's footsteps. For Elian, consciousness was a distant shore he could no longer reach. He was adrift in a sea of psychic agony, tossed on waves of stranger fear and phantom pain, but there was an island in that sea, a point of stillness. It was the solid wall of Cale's chest against his back, the unyielding strength of the arms that held him, the steady metronomic thump of a heart that seemed to beat not with blood, but with quiet resolve. This was his only reality. The physical sensations were anchors in the storm, the slight creak of armor plating with each step, the faint, clean scent of ozone and sterilized polymers that clung to Cale's uniform. The pressure of a gloved thumb resting against his ribs, a point of constant, reassuring contact. He was being carried. The realization came not as a thought, but as a deep, cellular knowledge. He was being held, contained, shielded. The psychic shrapnel that had torn him asunder still flew, but it struck a barrier before it could reach him. It was Cale. Cale's mind was a fortress, a citadel of absolute discipline. It was not empty, but it was ordered, every thought and impulse logged and categorized, running on silent, efficient loops of code and conditioning. To Elian's shattered senses, this profound mental control was a balm, a cool hand on a fevered brow. The chaos of the world outside could not penetrate this moving sanctuary. He curled into the space afforded him, his cheek pressing against the hard, unyielding material of Kyle's armor. It should have been uncomfortable, but it was the safest thing he had ever known. He could feel the low thrum of Kyle's internal systems, the quiet whir of his biomonitors, the faint electric hum of his neural interface. It was a language of pure function, a lullaby of machinery and purpose, and beneath it all, something else. A flicker, a deviation in the perfect code, a warmth that did not belong to the machine. Kyle moved with an unnerving grace, a predator's economy of motion. He navigated the panicked exodus from the market square, a ghost in the chaos. No one impeded him. They saw the matte black armor, the impassive helmet that hid his face, the sigil of the consortium on his shoulder, and they melted away. He was an instrument of a power they knew better than to question. His internal chronometer marked the passage of time with cold precision. 17 minutes since mission failure, 14 minutes since asset retrieval. He was falling behind schedule. His comms unit chirped, a soft, insistent tone in the helmet's interior. He ignored it. Protocol demanded an immediate status report. He had nothing to report that he was willing to share. Asset incapacitated but stable. Retrieval in progress. The words formed in his mind, the standard sterile language of his function. But he did not transmit them. To transmit would be to acknowledge the system. To reconnect himself to the web of command and control he was beginning to perceive as a threat to the fragile quiet he was protecting. The comms chirped again, more demanding this time. A data request followed, an attempt to remotely access his biomonitors and tactical feed. He blocked it. A simple command, a flicker of will, and the request was denied, firewalled by his own authority as an executor. It was an act of silent, profound rebellion. He had never denied a data request before. The concept of denial was barely a part of his functional vocabulary. He executed commands. He did not refuse them. He felt a faint tremor run through the man in his arms. Elian's breathing hitched, a soft, broken sound. He was feeling Kale's defiance. The psychic link born of trauma was a two-way street. Elian was not just being shielded, he was listening, sensing the subtle shifts in his protector's state. He felt the cold wall of Kale's programming, and he felt the first hairline crack that had appeared in its surface. Kale adjusted his grip, pulling Elian's pliant form more securely against his chest. The movement was infinitesimal, but it was a conscious act of reassurance. He was aware for the first time of the specific weight and shape of another being, not as a target or an objective, but as a presence. The scent of Elian's hair, something faintly like ozone and rain, the fragile flutter of his pulse against Kale's wrist. These were data points, but they were not sterile. They were coalescing into something new, a feeling. He identified it, cross-referencing it with his psychological conditioning files. Protective instinct, a trait encouraged in the defense of state assets, but rigorously suppressed when it became personal. What he was feeling was personal. It was a malfunction, a beautiful, dangerous malfunction. He reached the extraction point, a darkened alleyway where a silent gray transport vehicle waited. The doors hissed open, revealing a Spartan interior and two consortium medtechs in sterile white uniforms. Their faces were impassive, their eyes cold. "Executor 7, the lead tech said, his voice flat and toneless. "Hand over the asset. We'll take him from here." They moved forward with practiced efficiency, a gurney sliding out from the vehicle's side. They reached for Elian. Kyle took a half-step back. The movement was subtle, but it was a clear and unambiguous refusal. The air in the alley grew thick with tension. The medtechs froze, their hands hovering in the empty space between them. They looked at Kale, then at the still form in his arms, and a flicker of confusion crossed their disciplined faces. An executor did not deviate. An executor did not refuse. "Executor," the tech repeated, a harder edge to his voice. "Our orders are to take the asset to the Eyrie for psychic reclamation. Release him." Kyle's helmeted gaze was unreadable. He looked down at Elian, whose eyes had fluttered shut. His breathing was shallow but steady. He was dormant, healing in the quiet Kale had provided. Handing him over to the techs meant handing him back to the noise, to the sterile, painful procedures of reclamation. It meant giving him back to the system that had broken him, the system that saw him only as an asset. Kyle looked back at the medtechs. He said nothing. His silence was more potent than any threat. He simply adjusted his grip on Elian, turned, and stepped into the transport. He did not place Elian on the gurney. He sat on one of the cold metal benches that lined the vehicle's interior, settling the unconscious reader across his lap. He held him there, a sentinel guarding a fallen king. The medtechs exchanged a look of disbelief. Then, with a shared, reluctant shrug, they retracted the gurney and sealed the doors. The transport pulled away, plunging the interior into a dim, humming twilight. Cale did not move. He just held on, the quiet promise he had made in the chaotic square solidifying into an unbreakable vow. "I'll carry you," and he would not put him down. The consortium's Sublevel 7 medical bay was a monument to sterile efficiency. The air, recycled to perfection, smelled of antiseptic and cold metal. The light was a flat, shadowless white, designed to illuminate without warmth. It was a place for repairing assets, not for healing people. As the transport docked and the doors hissed open, the scene repeated itself. A new team was waiting, 2 handlers in gray uniforms and a senior physician, her white coat so crisp it seemed to crackle with authority. She held a data slate, her eyes flicking between its glowing screen and the executor who had just stepped out of the vehicle. Cale still held Elian. He hadn't shifted his grip since the alleyway. Elian remained a pale, still figure against the stark black of the executor's armor, his head pillowed on Cale's shoulder. The physician, a woman named Dr. Aris, had a face that was a mask of professional calm, but her jaw was tight. "Executor 7, she began, her voice clipped and precise. "Report. What is the asset's condition?" "Incapacitated," Cale's voice was a low, synthesized baritone, filtered through his helmet's vocoder. It was devoid of inflection. "Psychic trauma. Vitals are stabilizing." "We've been monitoring them," Aris countered, tapping her slate. "His neural activity is erratic. He requires immediate immersion in a reclamation tank. Give him to the handlers." The 2 handlers stepped forward, their movements synchronized and impersonal. They were a part of the facility's machinery, human cogs in the great grinding clockwork of the consortium. Cale did not move. He simply stood there, a black statue of defiance, the unconscious reader cradled in his arms. The handlers stopped, a foot away from him, waiting for a command they seemed to realize would not come. Dr. Aris's composure finally fractured. A flicker of irritation crossed her features. "Executor, this is not a request. Your protective detail is concluded. The asset is now under the care of the Medical and Psychic Reclamation Division. Stand down and release him." Kyle's head tilted, a slow, deliberate motion. His helmeted face, with its single dark visor, was impossible to read, yet the gesture was laden with intent. It was analytical. It was dismissive. "Negative, why?" he said. The word, a single cold syllable, hung in the sterile air like a shard of glass. The handlers took an involuntary step back. Dr. Aris's eyes widened slightly. An executor did not say negative to a direct order from a superior division head unless it conflicted with a higher priority directive. "On whose authority?" Aris demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. Kyle started walking, not toward the waiting reclamation tank, but toward the corridor that led to the executor barracks. He moved with the same implacable certainty he'd shown in the market square. The handlers and the doctor were forced apart, an invisible wave of sheer will pushing them aside. "My own," Kyle said, his voice unchanging as he passed them. The statement was so profoundly alien, so contrary to the fundamental principles of his existence, that it left them speechless. An executor had no authority of his own. He was a conduit for the consortium's will. He was a weapon that waited to be aimed and fired. For him to claim personal authority was like a gun claiming the right to choose its own target. It was a terrifying, system-level error. Kyle didn't look back. He continued down the long, white corridor, his heavy boots making no sound on the polished floor. His destination was Sector Gamma, the executor's wing. It was a place of monastic austerity, designed for efficiency, not comfort. Each executor was assigned a habitation unit, a small, featureless cube containing little more than a recharging alcove, a sanitation unit, and a single hard slab of a bed. It was a space designed for a machine to rest and maintain itself. Cale accessed his unit with a touch of his palm against the scanner. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the gray, empty room within. He stepped inside and the door slid shut behind him, sealing them in. The silence here was different from the silence of his mind. It was an artificial, pressurized silence, the absence of all sound. He finally moved to lay Elian down. He crossed to the narrow bed, intending to place him gently on its surface. But as he bent, a low moan escaped Elian's lips. His fingers, which had been limp, twitched and tightened, clutching the fabric of Cale's undersuit. His brow furrowed in a spasm of pain, a reaction to the anticipated loss of contact. The psychic storm on the edges of his awareness surged, threatening to breach the walls Kyle had built around him. Don't! The thought was not a word, but a raw, desperate feeling projected directly into Kyle's mind. The quiet. Stay. Cale froze, his body held in a half-crouch over the bed. He looked down at the man in his arms. He saw the stark terror in the lines of Elian's face, even in sleep. He was a drowning man, and Cale was the only thing keeping his head above water. To let go would be to let him sink back into the screaming depths. The logic was flawed, emotional, unacceptable, but the conclusion was absolute. He straightened up, Elian still held securely in his arms. He turned and sat down on the edge of the hard bed, his back straight, his posture as perfect as it was on a parade ground. He settled Elian across his lap, cradling his head against his chest. One hand splayed protectively over his back. The tension in Elian's body eased. His breathing deepened. The psychic turbulence subsided, retreating once more to a manageable distance. From his comms unit, a new voice emerged, cutting through the silence of the room. It was calm, measured, and carried an authority that dwarfed Dr. Aris's. It was the voice of Director Vance. "Executor 7, she said, her tone laced with a faint, chilling curiosity. "Report to my office, immediately. Come alone." Cale looked down at the sleeping man he held. He was a warrior, an engine of destruction, sitting in a sterile room holding a broken psychic as if he were a child. He had defied medics, handlers, and doctors. He had broken a dozen protocols. And now he was about to defy the director herself. He reached up and deactivated his external comms link. The director's voice vanished. There was only the sound of Elian's soft breathing and the low hum of the facility around them. He would not leave. He would not put him down. He would wait. He would guard this small pocket of peace, this fragile silence, against the entire world if he had to. The room was a cage of quiet. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the subtle shift of the artificial light outside the door's viewport from a simulated daylight to a dim, nocturnal blue. Kyle did not move. He remained seated on the edge of the bed, a living statue of black armor and unwavering resolve. He did not require sleep in the same way a normal human did. His body could enter a low-power state, a vigilant standby, allowing his systems to recharge while maintaining full situational awareness. But he did not even do that. He remained fully online, his senses focused on the single, fragile life he held. In the sanctuary of Cale's silence, Elian began to drift back toward himself. His journey was slow, like a diver ascending from a crushing depth, pausing at intervals to let the pressure equalize. He surfaced in fragments. The first thing to return was scent. The sterile, ozonic smell of Kyle's armor, clean and sharp. Underneath it, a fainter, warmer scent that he couldn't identify, something organic and uniquely Cale. It was the scent of safety. Then came touch. The unyielding hardness of the chest plate at his back, the surprising softness of the fabric of the undersuit where his cheek was pressed. The steady, rhythmic rise and fall of Cale's breathing, a slow, powerful tide that seemed to pull his own fractured breaths into sync. He felt the weight of a hand, large and solid, resting between his shoulder blades, a point of constant grounding pressure. He did not open his eyes. The world of sight was too much, too loud. The memory of the market square, the explosion of psychic light, was a raw wound behind his eyelids. He preferred the darkness. In that darkness, his own mind began to reassemble itself. He took inventory of the damage. It was extensive. The delicate pathways of his psyche were frayed, some severed completely. The filters that allowed him to distinguish his own thoughts from the endless torrent of others were gone, shattered like glass. He was raw, exposed, an open nerve ending. Yet he was not in pain. The constant screaming input of the world was gone. There was only Kyle. He reached out with a tentative thread of consciousness, not to read, but simply to feel. Kyle's mind was unlike any he had ever encountered. It was a vast, silent, ordered space. He could perceive the processes running, threat assessments, environmental analysis, biometric monitoring, but they were like silent, glowing lines of code in a dark, empty cathedral. There were no stray thoughts, no chaotic emotions, no buzzing anxieties or petty hatreds. It was clean. It was pure. It was the most beautiful thing Elian had ever felt. But as he lingered in that quiet space, he began to perceive the architecture of the silence. He saw the walls, thick and high, built of discipline and brutal conditioning. He felt the echoes of the pain that had been required to build them, the ghosts of a boy who had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt as a weapon. The silence was not an absence of feeling, it was a containment of it. Deep, deep down, beneath the layers of protocol and programming, was a core, a singularity of immense, compressed emotion, loneliness so profound it had the gravity of a dying star, a capacity for loyalty that had been twisted into blind obedience, and a nascent, terrified flicker of something else, something that had been sparked in a chaotic market square, something that was growing in this quiet room. It was for him. He could feel it. A fierce, protective instinct that was fundamentally illogical and entirely absolute. This realization was so overwhelming, so intimate, that Elian felt a tremor of his own run through him. This perfect soldier, this flawless machine, was breaking his own fundamental nature to keep him safe. He was not just a shield. He was a sacrifice. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A flashback, sharp and clear. He was a child, no older than 6, newly arrived at the Eyrie. The facility for training readers was a beautiful prison of glass and light, but for a boy whose mind was an open door, it was a torture chamber. The thoughts and emotions of hundreds of other children and their instructors crashed over him in a relentless, agonizing wave. He'd hidden in a supply closet, hands pressed over his ears as if that could stop the noise, rocking back and forth, weeping. An instructor had found him, a woman with a kind face and thoughts like shards of ice. She had pulled him out, not with anger, but with a cold disappointment that was far worse. "You are a receiver, 4B," she had told him, her thoughts a clinical counterpoint to her gentle voice. "He is weak. The flaw must be corrected. You do not hide from the signal, you learn to parse it. You are an instrument. An instrument feels nothing. It only conveys." He had spent the next 15 years learning to be a perfect instrument. He had learned to build flimsy walls, to categorize the noise, to survive in the storm. But he had never, not once, known true silence. Not until now. The man holding him was also an instrument, forged in a different but equally merciless fire. Yet he had chosen to feel. He had chosen to disobey. He had chosen to protect. Elian's breathing hitched, and a single hot tear slid from the corner of his eye, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. It was a tear of gratitude so profound it felt like grief. He did not move, did not make a sound. He simply let the tear fall, a tiny, silent offering in the quiet cathedral of Cale's arms. Cale registered the increase in Elian's lacrimal secretions and the slight uptick in his heart rate. His diagnostic systems flagged it as a sign of emotional distress. But his new malfunctioning instinct interpreted it differently. It was not pain, it was release. He shifted his grip slightly, his thumb moving in a slow, soothing circle on Elian's back. It was an awkward, untutored gesture, a clumsy attempt to speak a language he had never been taught. But Elian understood. He felt the gesture not just on his skin, but in his mind. A quiet, steady reassurance. I am here. You are safe. In the quiet of the room, two broken instruments of a soulless system were beginning to heal each other, forging a new purpose in their shared silence. The silent standoff could not last. The consortium was a body, and Cale was a rogue cell. The body's immune system was beginning to respond. A chime, soft but insistent, sounded at the door. Cale's head lifted, his posture unchanged. He did not respond. A moment later, a voice, crisp and female, emanated from the door speaker. Executor 7, this is Major Eva Rostova, Gamma Sector Command. Open this door. That is a direct order from a commanding officer. Kyle remained silent. His internal sensors analyzed the voice pattern, the micro-expressions he knew would be on her face, the tactical positioning of the two-man fire team he could hear taking up positions on either side of the corridor. Rostova was a soldier's soldier, a product of the same crucible that had forged him. She believed in the system, in the chain of command. She would see his actions not as rebellion, but as a critical, dangerous malfunction. He was a broken weapon that needed to be decommissioned. Cale, she said, her voice softening slightly, a calculated psychological tactic. Using his given name was meant to bypass the executor programming and appeal to the man beneath. I know you're in there. We have your biometrics. We know the asset is with you. Director Vance has authorized me to use any means necessary to resolve this situation. Don't make me do that. Open the door. Elian stirred in his arms, his consciousness rising closer to the surface. He could feel the threat outside, a knot of disciplined aggression and cold intent. He pressed closer to Cale, a subconscious, instinctual movement toward safety. Cale's arm tightened around him in response. A memory, sharp and cold, flashed through Cale's mind. A training simulation in the Crucible. He was a cadet, no older than 12. The scenario was hostage rescue. The hostage was a training dummy, but the opposing force was another cadet, a boy named Reese who had been his only friend, the only one who seemed to see past the emerging perfection of Cadet Cale. The objective was to neutralize the threat and secure the hostage. Cale had hesitated for a fraction of a second, trying to find a non-lethal solution. In that fraction of a second, the training dummy was killed. His instructor's voice, cold and disappointed, echoed in his memory. An executor does not hesitate. An executor does not have friends. He has targets and objectives. Your sentimentality is a flaw. It will be burned out of you. And it had been. He'd been put through 3 days of brutal reconditioning, physical and psychological, until the concept of personal attachment was buried under layers of scar tissue and protocol. Reese had been transferred to another unit the next day. Cale never saw him again. He had learned his lesson. He had become the perfect weapon, devoid of sentiment. Until now. He was hesitating again. For another fragile boy who had somehow found his way past all the walls, all the conditioning. This time, he would not fail. Major, Cale's voice broadcast into the corridor, startling the soldiers outside. My primary directive is the preservation of a priority alpha asset. The asset's current condition is unstable. Removal from this unit would present an unacceptable risk to its psychic integrity. That determination is not yours to make, Executor. Rostova's voice was like ice. That is the purview of the medical division, which you have already defied. You have 10 seconds to open this door before we breach it. The countdown began, a digital clock appearing in Kyle's internal display. 10, 9, 8. He had options. He could fight. He was in his own quarters, a defensible position. He could likely neutralize the fire team and possibly Rostova herself. But that would be an act of open warfare against the consortium. They would be fugitives within their own walls, hunted and cornered. There would be no escape. 7, 6, 5. He looked down at Elian. His eyes were still closed, but he was no longer sleeping. He was listening, his mind connected to Kale's, feeling the tactical analysis, the branching paths of probability. He felt Kale's resolve to fight, the cold, deadly calm that was settling over him as he prepared for violence. A small hand came up and rested on Kyle's chest plate. It was a gesture of profound trust. Elian's thoughts, faint but clear, brushed against his own. Not like this, not more noise, more pain. 4, 3, 2. Kale made a new decision, another one born not of logic but of this strange, new instinct. He would not fight them here. He would not turn this small sanctuary into a battlefield. He sent a single encrypted burst of data to the door's control panel. 1, 0. With a soft hiss, the door slid open. Major Rostova stood there, flanked by her 2 soldiers, their pulse rifles raised. She was a tall, severe woman with eyes the color of slate. She took in the scene, the legendary Executor 7 sitting on his bed, holding the unconscious reader like a Pieta, and her expression for a single, unguarded moment was one of pure astonishment. Then the mask of command snapped back into place. "Stand down, Executor," she ordered, her voice tight. Kyle did not stand. He did not move at all. He simply met her gaze, his own hidden behind the black visor of his helmet. "The asset remains with me," he stated. It was not a negotiation. It was a fact. "That is not an option," Rostova said, taking a step into the room. Her soldiers fanned out, their weapons trained on Kyle. "We will not harm him, but we will sedate him and take him to the reclamation ward. And you will be taken for a full diagnostic and psych evaluation. You are malfunctioning, Kyle." "I am operating at peak efficiency," Kale countered, his tone flat. "My analysis has concluded that the standard reclamation process is the primary threat to the asset's long-term viability. I am implementing an alternative recovery protocol." "An alternative protocol you invented 2 hours ago?" Rostova scoffed, a bitter, incredulous sound. "You are an executor, not a xenopsychologist. You follow orders. You don't create them." She gestured to her soldiers. "Take the asset. Use non-lethal force on the executor if he resists." The 2 soldiers moved forward. They were younger than Kyle, fresh from the crucible, their movements precise and eager. They saw a legend, and they were about to be the ones to bring him down. Kyle watched them approach. He could break the wrist of the first one before he could even raise his sedative injector. He could disarm the second in the time it took him to blink. He could have them both unconscious on the floor in under 3 seconds. But he did not. He just sat there, his body a fortress around. Elian. And then Elian's eyes opened. They were no longer the turbulent gray of the storm. They were clear, a soft, luminous silver. He looked past Kyle, directly at the approaching soldiers. He did not say a word. He did not move. He simply looked. And the soldiers stopped. Their faces went slack, their rifles lowered. A profound confusion washed over them. They looked at their hands, then at their weapons, as if seeing them for the first time. They looked at each other, then back at Elian, their eyes wide with a dawning childlike wonder. It was not an attack. It was not a psychic blast. It was the opposite. For the first time in their lives, the noise in their own heads had stopped. The endless litany of training, protocol, and aggression that had been drilled into them since childhood was gone. There was only a perfect, beautiful silence. Elian had not projected a thought. He had projected his sanctuary. He had shared the quiet that Kyle had given him. Rostova stared, her military discipline warring with the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing. Her soldiers were standing down, their expressions beatific, their weapons hanging forgotten in their hands. "What did you do to them?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and terror. Elian's gaze shifted to her. Kyle felt a wave of profound, weary sadness wash through their link. It was Elian's sadness for these soldiers, for Rostova, for Kale, for himself, for all the broken instruments. "He's showing them what peace feels like," Kale said, his voice softer than Rostova had ever heard it. "It's something the consortium forgot to program out." Rostova stood frozen, caught between her orders and the undeniable reality in front of her. The situation had escalated beyond anything her training had prepared her for. This wasn't a malfunction anymore. It was a revolution, quiet and intimate, happening in a 10 by 10-foot room. Director Vance observed the scene not in person but through the high-fidelity optical sensor hidden in the ceiling of Kyle's quarters. She watched on a massive screen in her office, a sterile, circular room at the apex of the consortium spire, overlooking the sprawling, orderly city below. Her expression was one of intense academic curiosity, like a biologist observing a novel symbiosis between two previously incompatible species. She saw Rostova, her best field commander, paralyzed by indecision. She saw two of her finest new executors effectively disarmed by an emotion they could not comprehend. And she saw Executor 7, her masterpiece, her most perfect weapon, acting as a living shield for the very asset he was supposed to control. It was, she concluded, fascinating. Her aide, a nervous young man named Cillian, stood rigidly by her side. "Director," he stammered, "Major Rostova is compromised. Shall I dispatch the Omega Squad? They are equipped with psychic dampeners." Omega Squad was the consortium's bluntest instrument. Genetically engineered brutes with minimal cognitive function and maximum loyalty, their minds were too primitive to be affected by a reader's influence. They would storm the room, retrieve the asset, and terminate the executor without a moment's hesitation. It would be efficient. It would also be a waste. "No, Cillian," Vance said, her voice a soft, melodic purr that did nothing to conceal the steel beneath. "Omega Squad is for putting down rabid dogs. This is more delicate. This is a teachable moment." She steepled her long, elegant fingers, her gaze fixed on the screen. She was not angry. Anger was an inefficient emotion. She was intrigued. Kale's deviation was more than a simple malfunction. It was an evolution. He had developed a personal attachment, a protective instinct that superseded his core programming. And the asset Elian, who had always been a passive, fragile receiver, was now actively using his abilities, not as a weapon of psychic assault, but as a tool of empathic de-escalation. They were changing each other. The implications were staggering. "Director," Cillian asked, confused by her inaction, "what are your orders?" "Patience," Vance said, a faint smile touching her lips. "The subject of any experiment is to observe how the variables interact. I want to see how far this goes." She zoomed the screen's view in, focusing on Kyle and Elian. She saw the way Kale held him, a posture of absolute, immovable protection. She saw the way Elian's hand rested on Kyle's chest, a gesture of complete trust. It was a perfect, closed loop of codependency. One provided physical sanctuary, the other psychic peace. Together they had created a fortress that it seemed even her own military couldn't breach without resorting to overwhelming destructive force. And that would destroy the very thing she now wanted to study. The asset's newfound stability and control were invaluable. A reader who could pacify soldiers with a look was a far more useful tool than one who simply gathered intelligence before shattering under the strain. Cale's actions in a strange, illogical way had produced a superior result. His insubordination had upgraded her asset. "Open a direct private channel to Executor 7's helmet," Vance commanded. "Audio only." Cillian tapped a few commands into his data slate. "Channel open, Director." In Cale's helmet, Vance's voice materialized, calm and intimate, for his ears alone. "Cale, you have made your point with remarkable clarity. It seems you have found a more effective method for stabilizing the asset than my entire medical division." Kyle's posture did not change, but he was listening. He knew this was the true test. Rostova was a soldier. Vance was a grandmaster playing a game whose rules only she understood. "Director," he replied, his own voice a low murmur, "the asset requires a non-hostile environment to recover. The Aerie is not that." I'm beginning to agree with you," Vance's voice was smooth as silk. "Your protocol has yielded unexpected but promising results. I am willing to allow it to continue. Under observation." A new set of parameters scrolled across Kyle's internal display. Directive Alpha 7 Gamma. Executor 7 is assigned as primary guardian and stabilizer for Asset 4B. All other protocols are subordinate to this one. You will be relocated to a secure observation suite. You will have everything you need. You will cooperate with my research team. You will continue to carry him. It was a capitulation, a victory, and a trap. Kyle knew it instantly. She was not granting them freedom. She was moving them to a more sophisticated cage, a laboratory where they would be the rats in her maze. He could refuse. But that would lead back to Omega Squad, to violence, to the noise and pain he was trying to shield Elian from. This was the only path forward that guaranteed Elian's immediate safety. Elian's thoughts brushed against his. She's putting a leash on us, but a longer one. He felt Elian's weariness, but also a flicker of cunning. They would play her game, for now. "We accept the terms," Cale said. On the screen, Vance smiled. "Excellent. Major Rostova," she said, her voice now broadcast into the room, "stand down. Escort the Executor and the asset to Observation Suite 9. Do not impede them." Rostova, who had been standing frozen this whole time, blinked as if coming out of a trance. She looked at her pacified soldiers, then back at Cale. Her expression was a mixture of confusion, frustration, and a grudging professional respect. "You heard the director," she clipped out, gesturing for her men to lower their non-lowered weapons. "Let's move." Kyle stood. The motion was fluid, effortless, even with Elian's full weight in his arms. He held him not like a burden, but like a part of himself. He turned and walked out of the room, past the dazed soldiers, past the formidable Major Rostova, and followed the path designated by the glowing indicators that now lit up on the floor before him. They were walking deeper into the heart of the machine, but for the first time, they were walking together. Two rogue variables about to disrupt the entire experiment from within. As they walked through the sterile white corridors, Elian shifted slightly, turning his face to bury it in the crook of Cale's neck. The gesture was one of exhaustion, but also of profound intimacy. He was hiding from the world, finding his only reality in the man who held him. He could feel Cale's pulse, steady and strong against his temple. He could feel the cold resolve in Cale's mind, a promise that this was not a surrender. It was a tactical retreat. Vance believed she had contained them. She had given Kyle a new directive, to carry Elian. She did not realize that it was no longer a directive he was following. It was a choice he had already made. She thought she was the one in control, observing her experiment. She couldn't feel the quiet revolution that was taking place in her subject's arms, the birth of a power she had no way to measure or contain, the power of two souls healing each other. Observation Suite 9 was less a room and more a habitat, a gilded cage. It was a large circular space with one wall made of one-way mirrored glass, behind which Vance's researchers would undoubtedly be watching their every move. The suite was furnished with a calculated sort of comfort, a wide, low bed with soft gray linens, a seating area with minimalist but comfortable chairs, a sanitation unit that was a study in seamless design. The air was perfectly filtered, the lighting programmed to mimic a natural circadian rhythm. It was designed to soothe, to lower their defenses, to make them forget they were specimens under a microscope. Kyle walked to the center of the room and stood there for a long moment, his sensors scanning every corner, mapping the hidden cameras, the audio pickups, the biometric sensors embedded in the floor and walls. He was cataloging the features of their new prison. Elian, still held against his chest, could feel the cold, analytical sweep of Cale's attention. He didn't need to see the room to know its nature. He could feel it through Kyle, the subtle hum of surveillance technology, the weight of unseen eyes, the sterile, cloying atmosphere of control. It was the area all over again, just with softer furniture. "You can put me down now," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. It was the first full sentence he had spoken since the mission. The words felt strange in his mouth. Alien things. Cale's arms tightened for a fraction of a second, an involuntary, reflexive action. The thought of letting go, of breaking the physical contact that had become his entire purpose for the last several hours, was surprisingly difficult. He was the shield. What was a shield without something to protect? He walked over to the large bed and gently, carefully, he lowered Elian onto the mattress. The moment their contact was broken, a profound sense of loss washed over both of them. For Elian, the quiet receded. It didn't vanish, but the buffer was gone. The low hum of the station, the distant psychic residue of the thousands of people within its walls, began to seep back in at the edges of his awareness. It was a low, insistent buzzing, like flies against a window pane. He flinched, a tremor running through his body, and instinctively curled into a ball, pulling his knees to his chest. For Cale, the loss was different. It was a sudden, unnerving emptiness. The fragile warmth he had been cradling was gone. His arms felt unnaturally light. The singular focus of his new directive dissolved, leaving him adrift. He was an executor without a mission, a guardian with nothing to guard. He stood by the bed, a monolith of black armor, feeling useless. He saw the distress on Elian's face, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the sheets. He saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. His protocol was failing. He was supposed to be the stabilizer. Putting him down had destabilized him. Without a thought, Cale sat on the edge of the bed beside Elian's curled form. He didn't touch him. He simply sat there, reestablishing his proximity, his presence a silent promise. He focused his mind, reinforcing the mental quiet, projecting it like a field. He imagined his mind as a fortress once more, but this time he extended the walls, building a perimeter of silence around the bed, around Elian. The effect was immediate. Elian's trembling subsided. His posture loosened, the tight knot of his body uncoiling slightly. He let out a long, shuddering breath and turned his head on the pillow to look at Kyle. His silver eyes were filled with a weary gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured. Kyle simply nodded, his helmeted face betraying nothing. But inside, a war was raging. His logical mind was screaming that this was unsustainable. He could not sit here forever. This was not a solution. It was a temporary, inefficient stopgap. But his new flawed instinct whispered that it was the only thing that mattered. A panel on the wall chimed and a compartment slid open, revealing a tray with 2 nutrient paste dispensers, a flask of water, and a set of plain gray clothes. A disembodied, synthesized voice spoke from a hidden speaker. Sustenance and a change of clothing have been provided. The asset is scheduled for a remote diagnostic scan in 1 hour. The executor will ensure his cooperation. Cale looked at the tray, then back at Elian. He knew what a remote diagnostic scan entailed. It was an invasive neural probe, a psychic intrusion designed to map the damage to Elian's mind. It would be painful. It would be terrifying. It would be a violation of the very sanctuary he was trying to create. He stood up and walked to the panel, taking the tray. He placed it on the small table near the bed. He picked up one of the nutrient dispensers and the water. He turned back to Elian. "You need to restore your energy levels," Kyle said, his voice flat, functional. But the gesture was anything but. He was taking care of him. Elian pushed himself up slowly, his movements stiff. He took the offered items, his fingers brushing against Kyle's gloved hand. The brief contact sent a jolt through him. He fumbled with the dispenser, his hand still shaking slightly. He managed to squeeze some of the tasteless beige paste into his mouth. It tasted like ash, but he forced himself to swallow. He needed to be stronger, for both of them. As he ate, a memory surfaced. A different cage, a different test. After the incident in the supply closet as a child, the instructors at the Eyrie had implemented a new training regimen. They would bombard him with psychic noise for hours on end until he collapsed. Then they would measure his recovery time. They would give him food and water and tell him to be stronger, to build better walls, to become a better instrument. He had always failed. His walls always crumbled. He looked at Kyle, who now stood by the mirrored wall, his back to the room, staring at his own reflection, or perhaps staring at the people he knew were watching from the other side. Cale was a wall of a different kind, not one Elian had to build, but one that had been offered to him freely. He was not just a shield. He was a partner. "They're going to scan me," Elian said, his voice quiet but steady. "I know," Cale replied, his back still to him. "It will hurt. I know." There was a long silence, filled only by the low hum of the suite's life support. "I won't let them," Kyle said. It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. He turned around. His helmet was still on, his face hidden, but Elian could feel the shift in his intent. The passive guardian was gone. The executor, the weapon, was coming back online, but this time he had chosen his own mission. "How?" Elian asked. "You can't fight the entire consortium." "The nature of a system is that it relies on its components to function," Cale said, his voice a low analytical rumble. "The diagnostic scanner requires a connection to the asset. If the connection is interrupted, the scan cannot proceed." He was talking about sabotage, about actively rebelling against Vance's experiment. "They'll know it was you," Elian said, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. "They will," Gall agreed, "and they will learn that this component will no longer function as they expect." He walked back to the bed. He did not sit this time. He knelt. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the powerful, dominant image of the executor, that it stole Elian's breath. Cale reached up with both hands, and with a soft hiss of depressurizing seals, he removed his helmet. Elian saw his face for the first time. It was not the face of a machine. It was a young face, younger than he had imagined, all sharp angles and pale skin, framed by close-cropped black hair. There were scars, a thin white line that bisected his left eyebrow, another that traced the sharp line of his jaw. But it was his eyes that held Elian captive. They were a deep, startling blue, the color of a winter sky, and they were filled with a fierce, terrible gravity. They were the eyes of a man who had seen hell and had returned, silent and unbroken. And they were looking at Elian with an expression of such focused, absolute devotion that it made his heart ache. "They broke you," Kale said, his voice raw, unfiltered by the vocoder. "I will not let them put the pieces back together in the wrong order." He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian. And Kale, for the first time in his life, knew exactly who and what he was fighting for. The hour passed in a state of charged silence. Elian finished his nutrient paste and drank the water, the simple act of taking sustenance feeling like a preparation for battle. He changed out of his torn and grimy mission clothes into the soft, anonymous gray uniform they had provided. The fabric was sterile, devoid of scent or texture, another small way the consortium sought to erase individuality. But as he dressed, he felt Kale's eyes on him, a silent, steady gaze that made him feel more seen, more real than he had in his entire life. Kale remained kneeling by the bed, his helmet resting on the floor beside him. He had not put it back on. It was a deliberate choice, an act of vulnerability and defiance. He was no longer hiding behind the mask of the executor. He was Kale, and he was here. He was using the time to study the suite's systems, his neural interface silently and invisibly probing the network. He was a weapon, and his mind was a blade. He found the diagnostic scanner's control node buried deep within the suite's local network. It was shielded, encrypted, but the consortium had made one critical error. They had built the system, and they had built him. He knew their architecture, their protocols, their backdoors. It was like reading a language he had been born to speak. A soft chime echoed through the room, signaling the start of the scheduled scan. "Asset 4B, please lie down and remain still," the disembodied voice instructed. "The diagnostic will now commence." Elian felt a familiar, sickening sensation, a cold, metallic presence at the edges of his mind. It was the probe, a psychic hook searching for purchase. In the past, he would have had no choice but to let it in, to endure the violation as it mapped and measured him like a piece of faulty equipment. He braced himself, his hands clenching into fists. But this time was different. Just as the probe began to latch on, Kale's eyes narrowed in concentration. A flicker of static, a jolt of psychic energy, not from Elian, but from Kale's direction. The metallic presence in Elian's mind vanished, replaced by a deafening roar of white noise. On the other side of the mirrored wall, in the observation room, a technician swore as his console sparked, a plume of acrid smoke rising from the circuitry. "Report!" a senior researcher demanded. "The scanner just overloaded, sir, a massive feedback pulse, routed directly from the suite's network. The primary coil is fused." Director Vance, watching from her own office, allowed herself another small, thin smile. He had done it. Her executor had not only defied her, he had actively sabotaged her multi-million credit equipment to do so. The audacity was magnificent. She had expected him to refuse, perhaps to create a physical barrier. She had not expected him to engage in cyber warfare. He was learning. He was adapting. He was becoming more than she had ever designed him to be. In the suite, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Elian looked at Kale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "What did you do?" "I gave the scanner something else to read," Kale said, his voice calm. He had rerouted the probe's energy signature back into its own system, creating a feedback loop that had effectively destroyed it. It was a simple, brutal solution. "They'll send people," Elian whispered. "Omega Squad." "Let them," Kale said. He rose to his feet, his movements fluid and certain. He picked up his helmet, and for a moment Elian thought he was going to put it back on, to become the faceless executor again. But instead he tucked it under his arm. He walked to the center of the room and turned to face the mirrored wall, the unseen observers. "Director Vance," he said, his voice clear and steady, projecting so that the audio pickups would catch every word. "Your experiment has a new variable, my will. Any further attempts to interface with Elian will be met with escalating countermeasures. He is not your lab rat, and I am not your dog. On the other side of the glass, the researchers stared in stunned silence. This was not insubordination. This was a declaration of independence. From her spire, Vance listened, her expression unreadable. Cillian, her aide, was practically vibrating with anxiety. "Director, this is unprecedented. He is openly threatening us. We have to neutralize him." "Neutralize him?" Vance mused, her gaze distant. "And what would that accomplish? I would lose my most interesting subject. No, Cillian, this is not a problem. This is progress." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with intellectual hunger. "He has established a boundary. He has articulated his terms. He believes he is in control." "But he is in control, isn't he?" Cillian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He destroyed the scanner. He has the asset. What can we do?" "Oh, we can do many things," Vance said softly. "A cage is not defined solely by its bars. It is defined by what the creature inside needs. He needs to protect the reader. The reader needs his silence. They need each other, and they both need what only I can provide: food, water, shelter, a world to exist in. They have built a fortress in the middle of my kingdom. Let them have their victory, for now. Let us see what grows in that fortress. Let us see what they become." She cut the feed to the researchers. "Leave them," she commanded the empty air. "No contact, no scans, no sustenance. Let us see how long the warrior's will can sustain them when the boy in his arms begins to starve." It was a new experiment, a crueler one, an isolation protocol. She would not try to break down their walls. She would simply wait for them to crumble from within. In Suite 9, an uneasy peace settled. Kyle returned to the bedside. He did not kneel this time, but sat on the floor, his back against the bed frame, a silent sentinel. He was close enough for Elian to feel his quiet, but not touching. He was giving him space, a choice. Elian lay on the bed, his body thrumming with adrenaline. They had won. They had defied the consortium, and for now they were safe. But he could feel the truth of their situation settling in like a cold dread. They were still trapped, and their captor was patient. He looked at Cale's profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the focused intensity in his blue eyes. He was so strong, so absolute. But even an executor could not fight biology. They had limited supplies. How long could they last? He pushed the thought away. For now they had this. They had this quiet room, this stolen peace. He reached out a hand, not physically, but with his mind. A gentle, tentative touch against the walls of Kyle's consciousness. He did not try to enter, did not try to read. He just let his presence be known. "Thank you, Kyle." He felt a response, not in words, but in a feeling, a deep, resonant sense of rightness, of purpose. For the first time, Cale's life had a meaning that was not programmed into him. It was a meaning he had found, and he would protect it until his last breath. He reached up and his fingers brushed against Elian's, which were hanging over the edge of the mattress. The contact was electric, a silent affirmation of their new, fragile alliance. They were two broken pieces, but together they were starting to form something whole. Days blurred. The suite's lighting system continued its placid cycle of artificial day and night, a constant reminder of the world outside their prison, a world they were no longer a part of. Director Vance was true to her word. There were no more scans, no more announcements from the hidden speakers, no more chimes at the door, and no more food. They finished the last of the nutrient paste on the second day. The water flask was empty by the third. Hunger began as a dull ache, a minor inconvenience for two men accustomed to hardship. Cale's genetically engineered body was remarkably efficient, capable of functioning for extended periods on minimal energy. Elian, however, was not. His body was a fragile, finely tuned instrument, and the psychic strain he had endured had left his reserves depleted. By the fourth day, the dull ache had sharpened into a gnawing pain. Weakness settled deep in his bones. Kyle watched him, his face a stoic mask that concealed a growing storm of anxiety. He saw the new pallor of Elian's skin, the slight tremor in his hands, the dark circles that bruised the delicate skin beneath his eyes. Every sign of Elian's deterioration was a failure on his part. He had promised to protect him, and he was watching him starve. He could try to break down the door. He was strong enough, but he knew it would be a futile gesture. Omega Squad would be waiting. The end result would be the same: capture, separation, and Elian being forced back into the Ares' painful reclamation process. Violence was a dead end. This was a battle of attrition, a siege, and they were the ones trapped inside the castle with dwindling supplies. On the fifth night, Elian was jolted awake by a nightmare. He was back in the market square, the psychic implosion tearing him apart. But this time, Cale wasn't there. He was alone, drowning in the screams, the noise crushing him, erasing him. He sat bolt upright in the bed, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. The psychic noise in the room was stronger now, his own hunger and fear eroding the mental walls he and Cale had built. Cale was on his feet in an instant, his silence a lie. Elian could feel the turmoil inside him, the cold, sharp edge of desperation. Cale was calculating his own failure, running projections that all ended in the same unacceptable outcome. "It's okay," Elian whispered, though it wasn't. It was just a dream. Cale didn't answer. He walked to the mirrored wall and placed his palm flat against its cool surface. "Director," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "this is pointless. You are damaging your own asset. Whatever you hope to learn from this, it will be lost if he perishes." There was no reply. Only their own reflections stared back at them, a gaunt, haunted-looking young man on a bed and a warrior in black, his shoulders slumped in a posture that was almost, but not quite, defeat. Elian watched him, and a profound shift occurred within him. For his entire life, he had been the protected, the fragile one, the precious, breakable instrument. Cale had stepped in and taken on that role of protector so completely, so absolutely, that Elian had allowed himself to fall into his old patterns. He had let Cale carry him, literally and metaphorically. But now, watching Cale stand before that implacable wall, his strength being slowly ground down by a foe he couldn't fight, Elian realized that a shield cannot stand on its own. It must be held. He slid off the bed, his legs unsteady. He walked to Kyle's side, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. He was dizzy with hunger, but his mind felt strangely clear. He reached out and placed his own hand on the glass next to Cale's. Their reflections stood side by side, the broken reader and the defiant executor. "He's wrong, you know," Elian said, his voice quiet but carrying a new, resonant strength. He was speaking to Vance, to the unseen observers. "He thinks I'm the asset, the one that matters." He turned his head to look at Kyle. Cale's blue eyes were wide, confused by this sudden turn. "But he's the one you can't replace, isn't he?" Elian continued, his gaze still on the director he could not see. "An executor with free will, an instrument that chose its own music. He's a singularity, a bug in your perfect system that could bring the whole thing crashing down. He's the real prize, and you're willing to sacrifice me, your disposable little psychic, to break him." A new chime echoed in the room, different from the others. It was the sound of a private comms channel opening. Director Vance's voice, smooth and amused, filled the space. "A very astute analysis, Asset 4B. You are more clever than your file suggests." Call moved instantly, stepping in front of Elian, shielding him with his body. The protective instinct was so ingrained he did it without thinking. Elian placed a hand on his arm. It's all right, Kyle. He looked past Kyle's shoulder toward the source of the voice. What do you want, Director? What I have always wanted, Vance replied. Progress. Understanding. You two are a new paradigm. A warrior who has learned empathy, a psychic who has learned to project peace. I want to know how you work. I want to replicate it. You can't, Elian said simply. You can't replicate this because you don't understand the components. You think it's about a shield and a weapon. You think he gives me silence and I give him… What? A purpose? It's not a transaction, Director. He looked at Kale, at the fierce loyalty burning in his eyes, at the fine lines of exhaustion around them. He felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Not just gratitude, but a fierce, protective love of his own. He was no longer the one being carried. They were carrying each other. You want to see how it works? Elian's voice grew stronger, ringing with a power he had never known he possessed. Then watch. He closed his eyes. He reached out with his mind, not to the network, not to the guards outside, but to Kale. He didn't just brush against the surface of Kale's consciousness. He opened the door to his own. He lowered every wall, every defense he had ever built. He invited Kyle in. See me, he projected, all of me. For Kale, it was like the universe opening up. He was flooded with Elian's entire existence. The terror of the Eyrie, the loneliness, the pain of 1,000 minds screaming in his head, but also the small hidden joys, the beauty of a particular sunset seen from a high window, the taste of real fruit, stolen once as a child, the deep, abiding love for the silence he had only just found. Kale felt Elian's fear, his fragility, his shame at his own weakness, and he did not flinch. He met it with his own truth. He let Elian see the crucible, the brutal training, the breaking of his spirit, the forging of the perfect weapon. He let him feel the profound, aching loneliness that had been his only companion for his entire life. He showed him the moment in the market square, the birth of the illogical, beautiful malfunction. He showed Elian that he wasn't a burden to be carried, but an anchor that had saved Kale from drifting away into the empty silence of his own programming. In the observation suite, the researchers cried out as their psychic sensors went haywire, overwhelmed by the sheer emotional and psychic energy pouring out of Suite 9. Vance watched, her face pale, her knuckles white, where she gripped the arms of her chair. She was seeing the data, the raw, unfiltered telemetry of two souls merging, sharing, becoming something more than the sum of their parts. It was not a symbiosis she could study. It was a mystery she could only witness. In the room, Kale and Elian stood inches apart, not touching, but more connected than any physical embrace. Kale reached out and gently cupped Elian's cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear Elian hadn't even realized he'd shed. I see you, Kale whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he finally had a name for. Elian leaned into his touch, his own hand coming up to cover Kale's. I see you, too. The door to the suite hissed open. They did not turn. They already knew. Director Vance stood in the doorway, her usual calm composure shattered. She looked not like a master manipulator, but like a scientist who had just seen her most fundamental laws of physics proven false. She looked at them, at the quiet, unshakable strength that now radiated from them, and she knew she had lost. She could not break them by force. She could not break them by deprivation. Their bond was not a variable in her experiment anymore. It was a new, fundamental constant. What do you want? She asked, her voice a strained whisper. It was Kale who answered, his eyes never leaving Elian's. A ship, a destination of our choosing, and your word that you will not follow. It was an impossible demand, but Vance looked at the new power radiating from Elian, a power that was no longer just passive, but active, amplified by Kale's own formidable will. She looked at her perfect executor, who now served a higher law than her own. She knew that if she refused, they would not just defy her. They would become a catalyst, a spark that could ignite the entire carefully controlled system she had built. Keeping them here was now the greater risk. "Done," she said, the word tasting like defeat. "There is a freighter, the Stardust Drifter, on landing pad 12. It will be fueled and supplied. It will have a clear flight path. Be gone within the hour." She turned and left, the door sliding shut behind her, leaving them alone one last time. They had done it. They were free. Kyle's hand was still on Elian's cheek. He searched Elian's face, a question in his eyes. Was this real? Was it over? Elian gave him a small, watery smile. "You carried me all this way," he said softly. "Now let's walk out together." The journey to landing pad 12 was a surreal procession. The corridors of the consortium facility, once a symbol of their confinement, were now a pathway to freedom. No guards tried to stop them. No alarm sounded. Director Vance, true to her word, had cleared their path. It was a silent, unnerving admission of her defeat. Kale walked at Elian's side. He had put his helmet back on, not to hide, but as a precaution. His hand rested on the hilt of his weapon, his senses on high alert, scanning for any sign of betrayal. But his mind was calm. A deep, steady calm that originated not from his programming, but from the man walking beside him. Elian walked with a strength that belied his days of starvation. Their psychic union had nourished him in a way food never could. He felt Kale's formidable stamina lending him support, Kale's unwavering resolve bolstering his own. He no longer needed to be carried because a part of Kyle was now inside him, a permanent internal fortress. He still felt the faint psychic buzz of the facility, but it no longer threatened to overwhelm him. It was just background noise, the hum of a world they were about to leave behind. They reached the massive hangar bay. The air here was different, tasting of ozone, hot metal, and the promise of open space. In the center of the bay, bathed in the harsh glare of work lights, sat the Stardust Drifter. It was an ugly, functional ship, a long-haul freighter designed for cargo, not comfort. Its hull was scarred and pitted from 1,000 journeys. It was perfect. As they approached the ship's ramp, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Major Rostova. She was not in combat gear, but in a simple officer's uniform. She stood alone, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Kyle immediately moved to place himself between her and Elian, his body tensing for a fight. "Stand down, Executor," Rostova said, her voice weary. She raised a hand, showing it was empty. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to see you off." Kyle remained wary, his posture not relaxing. "Why?" Rostova's gaze shifted to Elian, who peered out from behind Kyle's shoulder. There was a strange look in her eyes, a mixture of resentment and something that looked almost like envy. "Those men you pacified," she said, her voice low. "Corporal Thorne and Sergeant Valerius. They've been reassigned to sanitation duty. Their psyche vals came back. Compromised. They scored too high on the empathy index. They're no longer fit for combat." She shook her head, a small, bitter gesture. "You broke 2 of my best soldiers by showing them peace. I just wanted to see the weapons that could do that one last time." Elian stepped out from behind Kyle. He met the Major's hard gaze without flinching. He felt the roiling conflict inside her, a lifetime of loyalty to a system that demanded she sacrifice her humanity, warring with the undeniable truth of what she had witnessed. He offered her a small, sad smile. "They're not broken, Major," he said softly. "They're healing." Rostova stared at him for a long moment, then let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows of the facility, a ghost of the old order watching the birth of the new. Kale and Elian turned and walked up the ramp into the ship. The interior was as Spartan as the outside, smelling of recycled air and machine oil. Cale went immediately to the cockpit, his movements efficient and sure. His training had included piloting dozens of vessel types, including this one. He strapped himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls, bringing the ship's systems to life with practiced ease. The ship hummed around them, a deep, resonant vibration. Elian stood in the doorway of the cockpit, one hand on the frame to steady himself. He watched Cale, the way the light from the control panels played over his helmet, the quiet competence in his every movement. This was his Kyle. Not just the silent guardian, but this too, the brilliant soldier, the master of the very machines they were using to escape. The ramp hissed shut, sealing them inside. The hangar bay doors began to grind open, revealing a square of pure, star-dusted black. "Strap in!" Kyle's voice came over the ship's internal comms, filtered and familiar. Elian found the co-pilot's chair and lowered himself into it, the acceleration harness clicking into place. Cale's hands moved with finality. The ship's engines roared and a powerful thrust pressed them back into their seats. The Stardust Drifter lifted off the landing pad, rose through the hangar, and shot out into the cold, silent freedom of space. The consortium facility shrank behind them, a gleaming, sterile jewel of light that soon became just another star in the vast, indifferent cosmos. They flew in silence for a long time, putting distance between themselves and the life they had left behind. The only sound was the low hum of the engines and their own soft breathing. Kyle put the ship on autopilot, the course set for a remote, uncharted system on the galaxy's edge. He finally powered down the console and the cockpit was plunged into the dim, soft light of distant nebulae, filtering through the main viewport. He turned in his seat. With a soft hiss, he removed his helmet and placed it on the dashboard. He looked at Elian, his blue eyes reflecting the starlight. The fierce intensity was still there, but it was softer now, tempered by a quiet sense of wonder. "Are you okay, Ott?" he asked, his real voice sounding startlingly loud in the quiet cockpit. Elian nodded, his own gaze fixed on the endless sea of stars before them. For the first time, the universe felt not like a vast, terrifying emptiness, but like a promise, a blank page. "I've never been better," he whispered. He could still feel the psychic echo of the consortium, a faint, distant stain on the silence of space. But out here, there were other voices, the slow, ancient thoughts of stars being born and dying, the vast, sleeping consciousness of empty space itself. It was a symphony, not a scream, and for the first time he could choose which instruments he wanted to listen to. He reached across the space between their chairs and took Kyle's hand. Cale's fingers, calloused and strong, curled around his own. It was a simple, grounding touch, a promise made in a chaotic market square, fulfilled in the silent expanse between worlds. He had been carried, he had been sheltered, he had been saved. And now they would stand together, they would walk together, they would fly together into the quiet, unknown future they had claimed for themselves. The ship, a tiny spark of defiance and hope, drifted on through the endless, beautiful night,